Hello. We're going to do a presentation today on B.F. Skinner, and it's on chapter 10 of About Behaviorism. So I love this chapter. I was so glad I was assigned this because a lot of this chapter by Skinner related to some of the reasons where I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor, I'm a school counselor, I'm a behavior specialist, whatever label you want to put it. I spend a lot of time trying to motivate people to change their behavior. And this chapter is about the inner world of motivation and emotion. If you want to flip to it and follow along or read more, when I mention something, I kind of put the highlights of the major sections there. Personalities is on page 153, life in the psyche 156, defense mechanisms 159, and then the inner causes and usefulness I kind of lumped together on pages 162 to 170. So, if you know anything about personalities, there's all kinds of theories of personality development. There's developmental, there's Jungian, there's one very common thing in the workplace environment and in career counseling is the Myers-Briggs. There are a bazillion variations of the Myers-Briggs, from the Game of Thrones typologies to the Harry Potter typologies to just general what career would fit your personality. And that's part of what made me interested in behaviorism is the question, what explains that? What explains the personality? And Skinner says, in simple terms, it's genetic endowment plus exposure to the environment. And that a species will acquire behavior, basically your instincts, under contingencies of survival. So a behavior of a herd of animals running because one of them saw a wolf and started running, that's an instinct. While an individual acquires behaviors, which are habits, under contingencies of reinforcement. So basically, when you're saying the Myers-Briggs type indicator creates 16 personalities, clusters, you're like, okay, these people all must have had common, one theory I have, a set of reinforcing circumstances in their life and maybe a common genetic endowment. But under Skinner's explanation, your personality is what you were born with genetically and how you were exposed to the environment. And he kind of addresses some of the things that I learned when I first learned to be a counselor, like under developmental psychology, like Erik Erikson. And it's very interesting. And of course, he addresses Freud a lot because Freud came before him, and he was sort of a radical departure from the Freudian approach. So he explains life in the psyche. So what's going on in our mind? So some schedules of reinforcement create scores of energy. Other schedules of reinforcement create depression. And special verbal environment imposes consciousness on behavior. You're inducing a person to respond to his own body while he's behaving. So that's a lot of words. But on the top picture I have of the which more in a black and white tone, the actual label underneath that is depression. So why would a little fella feel depressed and then another little fella feel like he's a superhero on top of the world? And Skinner answers that is a part of it, a huge part of it, is the schedules of reinforcement. So a little fella that's given reinforcement and told to dress like a superhero and encouraged and appropriate behavior modeled in society, he gets reinforcement from his also from his parents, also from his peers, because he's reacting appropriately. A little fellow who maybe has a genetic endowment, maybe towards some depression, but also has schedules of reinforcement where maybe he's yelled at a lot, lots of punishers in his life, doesn't learn how to model appropriate behavior, therefore the peer group doesn't give him a lot of schedules of reinforcement. You can see how that would create these psyches or personalities or tendencies toward behavior. The same in classroom management and team leadership and adults. You learn to reinforce people. You thank them for a job well done. And when you do that, generally most people respond positively. And the observation piece, the I at the bottom, when you're doing, for me, I should say, when I work with an individual and trying to provide therapeutic interventions to help them behave more appropriately. My work is with students, so a lot of it is helping them understand how to either socially interact or how to become less averse to completing schoolwork. I'm trying to teach them to observe in their own body, and I'd never realized that it was in terms of behavioral responses. I'm talking like, okay, what's going on? What happened before? Why do you feel, or what have you observed about your feelings? What happened before you became resistant? And also, I've learned a lot. There's a anecdotal evidence, and I believe some research, but I can't back it up or quote it. So I'm just saying I believe there's some research. I know there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that a lot of kids start, particularly kids that drop out of school and become very disengaged, start disliking school or saying, I don't like school, something in the psyche, around third grade. So what happens in third grade? Third grade is when the work gets hard. Kindergarten, first grade, and some of second, you get a lot of positive reinforcement, not really grades, so you're not really evaluated negatively as much. Third grade is when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in a lot of the curriculums, and you start getting F's on your paper. You start getting, and if I used the word negative reinforcement a minute ago, I apologize. You start getting aversive stimuli in response to some of your efforts. And I think that some of that may condition students to not like or change in their psyche. They start associating school with aversive stimuli. So I'm explaining that in Skinner terms, not in how I used to do it. Now, Freud is interesting. Freud, I'm not a big fan of, but he was brilliant because he was the first or major groundbreaker of explaining some of the behaviors of human beings. So I won't go into all detail of Freud's defense mechanisms because this is not a psychoanalysis class. But basically, Freud described a lot of our psychic processes as being unconscious motivators. And some of them were really bizarre. So like one mentioned in the Skinner text is that perhaps a woman would have a miscarriage because of some unconscious hatred of the father, or the child had an unconscious hatred of the father. Freud had all those weird Freudian and Oedipus complexes, which made no sense. But in terms of Skinner explaining Freud, it made sense in this book because Freud was before him and profoundly regarded as a leading proponent of how the mind works. And his was all based on subconscious and how the subconscious developed, and allowing the subconscious to like free associate. Just laying on a couch and talking would make one release some of these unconscious drives and motivations and defense mechanisms, and one would be better. Skinner explained that as those defense mechanisms are not psychic processes, whether they're unconscious or conscious. He says your defense mechanisms are effects of contingencies of reinforcement, and they're usually related to punishment. And another way that he described that is the way you're reinforced in your family and the way you react at home might be, and is often very different than the way you interact with in the workplace, or for example, a soldier on the battlefield. There's very different contingencies of reinforcement. So the way you behave, the way you think, your defense mechanisms in place are really not conscious or unconscious. They're just effects of the reinforcement you received. Now, if you've ever studied psychology, even intro to psychology, you're going to learn about Erik Erikson, and he was around about the same time. He's another big guy. And I'll just give one example. In the early years, one of Erikson's psychosocial stages of development is called trust versus mistrust. It's ages 1 to 2. And he explained that as Erikson, that at this stage, an infant or a toddler learns that the world is either a safe place that they can trust, or they learn it's not a safe place and they don't trust adults and they're frightened. Skinner believes that this is simply consistent reinforcers breed trust, inconsistent reinforcers breed mistrust, which kind of makes sense. If your parent is always consistently praising you for appropriate behavior, consistently working with you on appropriate social skills, you get modeled good behavior, and it's what you perceive as positive stimuli, that's going to create a different set of developmental growth than for a toddler exposed to aversive stimuli. Inconsistent, angry, harsh environments are going to develop a different dimension of a personality, according to Skinner. Now, one of the things I really enjoyed about this is that Skinner thought inner causes are useless. There's a false sense of cause associated with feelings. And I love this. It's supposed to be, there's a really tiny quote next to the word false on the first bullet point, but I am quoting Skinner. There's a false sense of cause associated with feelings. So I love that, because when I work with students, a lot of times they'll say, well, how was school this week? And we're like, I didn't feel like doing it. And it's like, so you didn't do your work because you didn't feel like it. Yeah. Well, is there a cause to your feelings? No, it just happened. So I'm learning and I'm loving the way I can kind of think about that and explain that to people. But mentalism, which is the process of thinking in your mind, has obscured the environmental antecedents, which would have led to a more effective analysis. So in other words, I'm actually using this language. Some of my students, I'm saying, well, all behavior actually has a reason in the environment. So let's think back to, is it maybe that you're refusing to do work because you perceive it as a negative stimulus? Or no, I shouldn't use the word negative. As I don't use the word aversive, but like unpleasant stimulus. So you're like, well, yeah, I don't like it. I was like, okay, you find that you're not getting good rewards back. You're not getting a sense of pleasure. It's not a positive stimulus. I try to use more kid words, but that's what I'm trying to do. But that's huge, because a lot of people will say, for example, a feeling like stress in my first picture. Stress causes my headaches. Stress causes depression. Stress causes lack of appetite. And in Skinner's chapter 10, he would have more said complex social interactions or consequences lead to these feelings that we label as stress, which makes it much more precise language. And in another example I put in here is behavior whatever your behavior is, if you change it, your consequences will likely change, and your effect, or what happened, will either increase or decrease. And I included the picture of the DSM-5 in there because we use that to diagnose, and in the ICD-10, which is not a, but you can't really see in there, but that's a big book, and it's got a big checklist of reported feelings and observable behaviors. But there's a lot of abnormal psych in the world, and it's very interesting to kind of think, like, how is this affected by mentalism? How much of it is behavioral? And I do agree with it, because I see a lot of times, I see people whose very inappropriate behavior reinforced by the family. What we call in counseling enabling behavior. We're like, okay, it's okay, just keep going, keep doing what you're doing, even though it's making us miserable. So I like the idea that I'm learning how to maybe talk about the environment and how to help people switch things around so that they're happier or that their loved ones behave differently. All right, that's the end of my presentation. Loved chapter 10. Welcome to any comments or feedback that you want to give me. I would like to propose that we think about the inner feelings we have. Are they a false sense of cause associated with feeling? And is it mentalism? Is it environment causes us to develop in certain ways? Think of our own childhood. Then you had trust versus mistrust. Maybe when you got into more of your teen years, when you start having the development of your identity, how did the environment shape our development of our personality in our adolescent years? In other words, where did you get positive stimuli, negatives, or aversive stimuli,